Alright guys, so the Total War series has long been celebrated for combining turn-based strategy and real-time tactical battles unlike any other game has been able to do, and its signature gameplay loop, conquering regions, developing resources, raising armies, and expanding further and further seems deceptively simple, yet it is the foundation of the player experience. On paper, this design appears elegant and satisfying. It provides a clear rhythm, expand, consolidate, strike, and repeat. However, beneath the surface, this loop reveals significant flaws. Over the course of a campaign, it tends to devolve into repetitive tasks, offering diminishing returns and predictable outcomes. Once a player has established a strong economy and a robust military, the rest of the campaign often becomes a foregone conclusion. The late game snowball, where one faction's momentum overwhelms all others, is not an isolated problem, but rather a symptom of a flawed core design that has continued from game to game in the series. So in this video, what I want to do is examine this issue in depth and propose 5 interesting, unique solutions. Adapting these could lead to a Total War experience that retains its scale and spectacle while introducing greater depth, challenge, and replayability. At its core, the Total War loop can be summarized as follows: capture a region, build infrastructure, recruit armies, and conquer more regions. While this simplicity is part of the appeal, of course, it becomes a major liability as campaigns progress. Early game expansion is engaging because the player is experimenting with strategies, exploring mechanics, and managing scarce resources. However, by mid-game, the system reveals its repetitiveness. Provinces are largely interchangeable, providing standard resource yields and unit recruitment options, rarely presenting unique challenges or opportunities. The strategic variation promised by historical or, in some respects fantasy settings as well, often fails to materialize. Politics and diplomacy become static, trade and the economy becomes predictable, and many other mechanics become formulaic. This predictability fundamentally undermines long-term player strategic thinking. Once a faction achieves economic and military dominance, player actions often feel trivial, as each turn merely involves optimizing the same set of tasks, managing cash flow, positioning armies, or constructing generic buildings. Battles themselves, of course, while visually impressive, often become exercises in force maximization rather than creative strategy, and the late-game snowball effect exacerbates this issue. Once a faction has established multiple high-level armies and secured its territories, the game world offers few real threats. AI opponents constrained by static decision trees rarely respond in meaningful ways, and the player experiences a form of mechanical degradation. Victory becomes inevitable, and the gameplay loop essentially disintegrates. And what ends up happening is player behavior reflects these design limitations. Experienced players tend to optimize mechanically, favoring elite unit spamming, ignoring diplomacy, bypassing mechanics like city development or trade specialization that offer limited rewards relative to effort. The loop encourages exploitation of systems rather than engagement with emergent strategy, and campaigns lose narrative weight as expansion becomes a series of interchangeable moves rather than a sequence of consequential events shaped by the interplay of political, diplomatic, economic, and military factors. Essentially, because of all these reasons and more, the Total War gameplay loop lacks both meaningful tension and dynamic feedback. Expansion should introduce new challenges to the player, provoke strategic adaptation, and alter the perception of risk and reward. Without these elements, campaigns devolve into repetitive cycles, and the late-game snowball emerges as a natural consequence of systemic simplicity. Addressing this issue requires rethinking the loop itself, integrating systems that introduce variety, emergent challenges, and meaningful consequences for player actions. So let's dive into some potential solutions. One of the most straightforward ways to break the monotony of the Total War gameplay loop is to make provinces and regions more than simple resource buckets. Currently, the average conquerable region on a Total War campaign map largely serves as a source of money and recruitment slots, offering minimal strategic differentiation. By introducing dynamic regional mechanics, each conquered territory could present unique challenges, opportunities, and narrative flavor. Provinces could have distinct political, cultural, or environmental characteristics that directly impact strategy. So, for example, certain regions could harbor minority populations with strong resistance tendencies, requiring investment in diplomacy, garrisoning, or cultural assimilation. Others might present environmental challenges such as harsh winters or droughts, affecting resource production or troop recruitment or movement. And trade or economy-focused regions could be vulnerable to piracy or economic manipulation by rival factions. These variations would force players to consider local conditions when expanding, creating a more layered strategic experience than the current click, build, and conquer approach. Total War has always given the player opportunities to have specific, unique characters play roles throughout levels of politics and government, or armies and trade and diplomacy. This could be developed even further here. Skilled and experienced leaders could stabilize provinces, improve resource yields, or negotiate local allegiances, while more incompetent leaders might increase unrest or reduce productivity. Players through all of this would then face meaningful choices with their characters, allocate their best administrators to high-value provinces, manage less competent leaders through political maneuvering, or risk rebellion by stretching resources thin. By making each province a dynamic, consequential element rather than a simple number in a spreadsheet, expansion would feel meaningful, and each campaign would unfold differently depending on the player's decisions and the region's unique attributes. Finally, integrating emergent events tied to regional characteristics could further enrich the loop. Natural disasters, localized uprisings, or shifting trade patterns could create organic challenges. Over time, these systems would encourage players to plan ahead, diversify their strategies, and remain engaged throughout the campaign. And presenting these challenges through more immersive means as well, beyond just the static events panel on the left side here, would make you feel you have even more agency as a player as well. Now, the next approach here to revitalizing the gameplay loop is to introduce a robust internal political system. In the current Total War meta, growth is almost universally beneficial. More provinces mean more money, more troops, and greater momentum. Rare events like rebellions or civil wars are often easily managed, and while mechanics like empire maintenance or arbitrary army number limitations do help to a certain extent, they just feel a bit artificial. Plus, there's also the fact that AI competitors rarely exploit internal weaknesses. As a result, internal stability rarely provides a meaningful challenge and constraint on your wider expansion. So by incorporating nuanced internal political dynamics, the game could create emergent challenges that force the player to engage with the internal dimension of empire management. Rival generals, ambitious characters from different classes of population, or powerful faction leaders could compete for influence, demanding privileges, promotions, or special rewards. If ignored, they might rebel, manipulate succession, or undermine policy decisions. Players would need to balance conquest and governance, consider loyalty in appointment choices, and anticipate factional rivalries that emerge organically over time. Older historical Total War titles do hint at this potential, but rarely realize it fully. In original medieval Total War, for example, each character could actually get a title and ownership to their provinces. This system created tension, but it was limited to inheritance disputes and occasional revolts. More sophisticated systems like that could track personality, ambition, and loyalty dynamically, creating emergent stories within the campaign. Internal politics could also interact with other systems. Rebellions might destabilize provinces, leading to economic penalties or reduced recruitment. Diplomacy could be constrained by the faction's internal coherence. By tying internal stability directly to expansion and military operations, the game would encourage players to consider the Empire as a living organism rather than a set of static provinces. This would absolutely mitigate the late-game snowball by introducing emergent consequences that challenge dominant players without relying on artificial scripted events. Another, but maybe more minor, improvement to the gameplay loop is to diversify the paths to success. Currently, conquest-focused strategies dominate. Of course, it makes sense, this is Total War, as capturing territory and eliminating rivals is the fastest and most reliable route to victory. Alternative victory conditions such as economic dominance, cultural influence, religious conversion, or diplomatic unification are often secondary, underdeveloped, or treated as optional. I think that designing asymmetric victory paths could give each campaign a unique strategic focus. For example, a mercantile faction, take Venice, could pursue economic supremacy through trade monopolies, port control, and financial manipulation, or a culturally influential faction could leverage propaganda, public works, and religious conversion to sway populations and extend soft power. And diplomatic factions could achieve victory by forging coalitions, treaties, and political marriages, rather than military conquest. Each path could involve unique challenges and require the player to engage with different systems, breaking the monotony of repetitive conquest. And of course, asymmetric victories could influence other factions' behavior dynamically as well. Rivals might perceive economic dominance as a threat and respond with trade embargoes, sabotage, or coalition building. Religious expansion could provoke crusades or ideological conflicts. These emergent consequences would encourage players to anticipate reactions and adapt strategies, further enriching the campaign loop. By making conquest one of several equally viable paths, campaigns would feel less predictable, more strategically diverse, and more rewarding for different playstyles. Now, one of the most persistent flaws in the Total War loop is the static nature of the campaign world. AI factions often respond inconsistently or illogically, which contributes to the late-game snowball effect and does reduce immersion. While developers have applied band-aid solutions such as forced aggression, recruitment bonuses, or scripted invasions, these measures feel artificial and fail to capture the emergent complexity that the series' scale could support. An adaptive world system would allow rival factions to assess the player's growth and respond strategically in ways that feel organic and emergent. Instead of relying on static cheats or pre-scripted triggers, new mechanics could include things like strategic resource competition. AI factions could actively compete over scarce or high-value resources rather than simply building armies. For example, if the player secures a region rich in iron for elite units, rival factions might invest in countering that advantage by targeting production centers, raiding caravans, or sponsoring rebellions to destabilize access. This would force the player to protect supply lines and think strategically about resource control, not just territory conquest. We could also have a further developed influence and espionage system. Currently, rival factions do engage in covert actions against the players, such as spreading unrest, bribing governors, or inciting separatist movements, but there could be a lot more depth in all of this, where military might alone cannot guarantee stability. Players would need to invest in counterintelligence, monitor loyalty, anticipate political threats, creating emergent tension that the current AI rarely generates. Also, we could have more emergent faction agendas. Instead of scripted goals, each AI faction could develop dynamic agendas based on their historical tendencies, strategic position, and player actions. A northern kingdom might focus on securing alliances and trade to outlast the player, while a neighboring faction may prefer rapid raids to weaken the player economically. These agendas would evolve over time, creating a living world that reacts logically rather than arbitrarily. By focusing on resource competition, more espionage operations, and emergent agendas, adaptive world responses would make the campaign feel like a reactive, strategic ecosystem. Expansion and victory would require more than brute force armies. The player would need to anticipate rival moves, protect key resources, and manage political and economic threats alongside military conquest. This approach ensures that late-game campaigns remain tense, unpredictable, and strategically rewarding, while breaking the monotony of the existing gameplay loop. The final point here I want to make is about pacing, one of the most underdeveloped aspects of Total War campaigns. While the early game naturally challenges players with limited resources and fragile armies, mid and late game often follow predictable, repetitive rhythms until a single scripted event, such as Realm Divide or an external invasion, disrupts them. This predictability diminishes engagement, reinforces the snowball effect, and reduces the loop to a mechanical exercise. Emergent emergent events and challenges that scale with player progress can revitalize this loop, providing tension and forcing adaptation. We could have epidemics and plagues. Historical Total War settings lend themselves naturally to disease mechanics. A plague could reduce population growth, strain recruitment, cause attrition in armies, compelling players to rethink expansion priorities, redistribute armies, or invest in public health infrastructure. Such events create emergent crises that feel organic rather than scripted. We could also have population movements and migration that are a bit more robust compared to what we've had so far. Dynamic population shifts can destabilize regions, especially in culturally diverse empires. Migratory pressures could lead to rebellion, require assimilation policies, or create new opportunities for diplomacy. This adds a strategic layer beyond military conquest, forcing players to balance cultural, political, and economic objectives. Another big shift that earlier Total Wars did make use of is introducing mid and late game innovations, technological changes. New siege engines, naval units, troop types can break the monotony of standardized armies, and players must adapt their recruitment and deployment strategies to account for evolving battlefield conditions, preventing armies from stagnating into elite unit spamming. And of course, we could have more dynamic events. Schisms, revolts, or ideological movements can appear dynamically, reshaping alliances and destabilizing regions. For example, a religious reform could lead to revolts in certain provinces where traditions are strong, compelling the player to prioritize diplomacy or suppression over straightforward conquest. Natural disasters, crop failures, fluctuating trade routes can create emergent pressures as well. Players must allocate resources carefully, adjust taxation, or negotiate with rivals, introducing new decision-making layers. And more importantly, all of these challenges should scale with player power rather than arbitrarily punishing success. The goal here isn't to restrict player agency and what you're able to do, but to introduce dynamic tension and break the loop of monotony. When combined with adaptive AI and factionalism systems, emergent events make the campaign world feel alive, unpredictable, and consequential. Players are no longer simply expanding and maintaining armies, they are navigating a living, reactive world where every decision you make can ripple across the map in unexpected ways. By integrating adaptive world responses and emergent challenges, Total War campaigns would transform from linear, repetitive experiences into complex, strategic narratives. Each campaign could feel unique, unpredictable, and deeply engaging, with the gameplay loop remaining challenging and rewarding from start to finish. Overall, the Total War gameplay loop of conquer, manage, expand, and repeat has provided decades of entertainment, yet its limitations have become increasingly apparent. The repetitive structure combined with the late-game snowball effect reduces both challenge and engagement for the player. By rethinking the loop and integrating systems that encourage dynamic provincial management, internal politics, asymmetric victory paths, adaptive AI responses, and emergent challenges, the series could reclaim its potential for deep strategic engagement. Creative Assembly's solution has been to make more unique factions, more faction-specific unit rosters, and mechanics. But in the grand scheme of things, these don't work very well for real strategic depth from beginning to end for long-term campaign gameplay. The solutions I try to explore and propose here, of course, depend on setting and era, but would not only mitigate snowballing, but also transform the campaign into a more reactive, unpredictable, and immersive experience. In doing so, Total War could evolve beyond its current plateau, offering players not just the spectacle of grand battles, but the intellectual and emotional satisfaction of navigating a living, breathing strategic world. The foundation is already in place. The next step is to give the depth it has long promised but has yet to fully deliver. Whether any of these solutions or innovations are made actually in future Total Wars is of course up in the air, but either way, I really enjoyed exploring them and sharing them with you, and I really hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you did, give it a like, drop any thoughts or questions in the comment section below, and if you think there's anything I missed or worth talking about as well, let me know down below. Subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this, and thanks for watching guys. I'll see you next time.